Have you ever kept a family secret for decades? I won't ask what, just curious.
I always thought graduations were supposed to be the kind of milestones that pulled families together, the kind of days where even the most dysfunctional households could set aside their usual chaos just long enough to snap a few photos, eat a sheet cake, and pretend everything was fine. For most of my classmates, that was exactly how it looked. Moms clutching bouquets of roses, dads holding up camcorders like it was still 1999, siblings dressed in slightly uncomfortable clothes, but grinning anyway. And then there was me, standing in front of my mirror on the morning of my high school graduation, curling my hair with shaking hands, trying not to think too hard about the text I had gotten the night before from my mom. "Honey, we're just so exhausted. We don't think we can make it tomorrow. But we're so proud of you." Exhausted. That was the word they used, the word they tossed at me like it would stick to my skin and make me sympathetic. Exhausted from what exactly? They didn't work night shifts, they weren't recovering from some marathon, they hadn't been up caring for a newborn. No, they had been doing what they always did, catering to my sister, Lily, who had turned every family moment into her personal spotlight since she was old enough to throw a tantrum in a shopping mall. If I'm being brutally honest, I had already suspected they would let me down. It wasn't the first time. My birthdays had always been subject to rescheduling if Lily had a dance recital or if Lily wanted to host a sleepover. Christmas morning was reorganized around her moods. When I won a debate competition last year, they didn't even show up to watch me argue circles around a panel of seniors, but they did send me a "congrats" text as they drove Lily to a nail appointment. So when my mom's message popped up on my screen, telling me they were too tired to make it to the single biggest event of my teenage years, I didn't throw the phone across the room, I didn't scream, and I didn't cry. I just stared at it for a long moment, and then set it face down on the bedspread, as if by turning it over I could also flip over the years of disappointment I'd stacked neatly inside myself like folded laundry. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I didn't need them. But then, against my better judgment, I opened Instagram. Scrolling through my feed felt like slicing my own hand open and sprinkling salt across the wound, because there they were, my mom and dad, beaming like teenagers themselves, sitting in a glossy spa lounge with Lily at the center of the photo. She was wearing a white robe, cucumber slices balanced on her eyes, while my parents raised glasses of champagne and smiled like they had just solved world peace. The caption under Lily's post read, "Family Spa Day. Much needed after a tough week." A tough week. I was finishing valedictorian level coursework, pulling late nights, and double-checking my speech in between, worrying about how I'd look in a cap and gown, but apparently, she was the one who had endured the tough week. I stared at the screen until my chest ached. It wasn't just that they skipped my graduation, it was that they had lied. They had looked me in the eye, through the blue glow of my phone, and told me they were too tired, too weary, too drained to watch me walk across a stage. And then they had turned around and toasted champagne while their other daughter soaked her hands in paraffin wax. It was like being told I didn't matter, not even enough to earn a flimsy excuse that held together for 24 hours. That was the moment the bitterness turned into something colder, something sharper. I had already been rehearsing my speech, practicing how I'd thank my teachers, how I'd acknowledge the late nights spent studying, how I'd keep my voice from cracking as I looked out into the crowd. But suddenly I realized the microphone wasn't just a piece of metal connected to a speaker. It was power. It was a chance to say something that couldn't be edited or ignored or brushed off with another text. And the idea lodged itself in my head, stubborn and immovable, like a splinter you can't quite dig out. I didn't cry that night, even though maybe I should have. Instead, I shut off my phone and stared at the ceiling until the shadows blurred together and the clock struck 2 in the morning. I thought about Lily's smug grin, the one she always wore when she got her way. I thought about my parents' empty seats that would sit like ghosts in the auditorium the next day. And I thought about the fact that, for once, they wouldn't be able to control the story. When my alarm rang, I put on my gown, zipped it up slowly, and stood taller than I ever had before. Because in that moment, I wasn't just going to walk across a stage to accept a diploma. I was going to walk across with every slight, every forgotten moment, every skipped event pressing down on my shoulders. And for once, I wasn't going to stay silent. What I didn't know yet was that my silence, up until then, had been the very thing that gave me the most ammunition. And when the microphone passed into my hands, the words that tumbled out wouldn't be the ones my parents expected, or the ones Lily would laugh about later. No, this time, the words would burn. And the first spark had already been lit. The morning moved like wet cement, heavy and slow, yet somehow determined to set around me whether I liked it or not, and while I pinned the cap that never flatters anyone's head shape, I kept replaying the spa photo like a loop that refused to buffer to the end. Because every time I thought I was numb to it, another detail surfaced. My dad's ridiculous terry cloth slippers, my mom's robe tied in a neat bow like a commercial, Lily's caption that called the week brutal as though picking a scent for a candle had taken years off her life, and I heard myself laugh out loud at that, a dry little sound that surprised me in the mirror, because the thing about hurt is that it starts as fire, then cools into a smooth piece of glass. And if you're careful, you can hold that glass and use the reflection to plan. I ironed the sash because busy hands beat spiraling thoughts, checked my speech for the 20th time, then for no good reason other than morbid curiosity, I opened the school portal again and stared at the program where my name sat under the word valedictorian. A word that still felt borrowed, like shoes a half size too small, and while I read the neat line that said I'd be addressing the class, it occurred to me that the microphone did not belong to the principal or the English department chair, or anyone who had ever patted my shoulder and told me to be gracious in the face of nonsense, because the microphone belonged to whoever could stand there without flinching and tell the truth in a way that made people sit up straighter. On autopilot, I packed lip balm, tissues I would not use, and the pair of nude heels that were comfortable only in theory, and when I stepped outside, the sky had that June blue brightness that dares you to pretend everything is fine. The kind of day where neighbors water lawns and call out congratulations across driveways, and sure enough, Mrs. Henson from 2 doors down leaned over her hydrangeas and said she hoped my parents brought roses, and I said something polite that tasted like chalk. Then climbed into my friend Mia's car because she had insisted on driving me, which was both a kindness and an indictment, since she knew those 2 empty seats in our row would otherwise ride with me like ghosts. Mia kept up a steady stream of chatter about tassel angles and whether the principal would mispronounce names, and I loved her for it, but halfway to the auditorium my phone buzzed with a new notification. And, because apparently I am a moth to my own flame, I looked, only to find Lily's story had added a boomerang of clinking glasses and a sticker that said self-care is not selfish. And the pettiness that I usually keep caged rattled the bars and asked very calmly why I continued to play nice, when nice had never kept me from being sidelined, and before I could overthink it, I opened the family group chat, the one with aunts who specialize in unsolicited opinions and cousins who still remember when Lily stole the last slice of pie and claimed she needed it more, and I dropped the spa photo with a single line, no commentary, just in case anyone is wondering where Mom and Dad are today. Then I put the phone face down and told myself that was not revenge, that was sunlight, and if people blister in sunlight, it is not the sun's fault. By the time we pulled up, the lawn was a sea of folding chairs and proud people holding programs like Tickets to a Better Life, and the usher led us to the rows marked for speakers and their families, which, in a twist the universe surely chose for dramatic irony, were in the very front where cameras would catch every smile and every absence, and there they were, 2 pristine seats with little tent cards that said my parents' names, and I could feel the heat rise under my collarbone, not a panic attack, more like a surge of something stern and useful, because I realized that while I could not conjure them into being, I could decide those chairs would not be shrines to their priorities. I walked to the side table where the ushers kept tape and markers for last-minute labeling, and I picked up a pen with the steadiness of someone tightening a violin string. Then I flipped both tent cards over and wrote in a clear, careful hand, "Reserved for the people who show up," after which I waved over Mia and her grandparents who had come early and were lingering in the back because they did not want to take a family spot, and I seated them there like royalty, fussing with the hems of their jackets and making sure their water bottles were within reach, and when Mia's grandmother squeezed my fingers and said that being asked to sit here felt like the best seat she had had in years. Something inside me loosened in exactly the place where the anger had been clamped. The lights blinked a warning that the ceremony would start soon, which meant my fine little rebellion would be captured in the background of countless photos taken by families who actually bothered, and just then my phone, which I had sworn I would ignore, vibrated like a tiny earthquake. As I glanced down, a cascade of messages began to stack: an aunt with a shocked face, a cousin with a yikes, my father with a question mark, my mother with "we need to talk," and Lily with a single line that read, "What are you doing?" And I typed back, slowly, sitting with the people who made it. Then I locked the screen and slid the phone into my bag like I had returned a dangerous animal to its crate. The band tuned in that charmingly chaotic way bands do, and row by row the faculty filed in like a parade of honest effort, and while I smoothed the front of my gown and took my seat directly behind the microphone I would soon hold, I understood that I had already taken the first swing, not with a shout but with placement, with a pair of chairs transformed from placeholders into honors, and as the principal stepped up and the audience hushed to that expectant silence that tastes like electricity, I felt my heart settle into a slow, deliberate beat, because the second swing would be words, and if I chose them well they would land where they needed to land and nowhere else. The principal welcomed everyone with that brisk tone administrators use when they are trying to sound ceremonial and efficient at the same time. The band launched into the first triumphant measure, and the room shifted as hundreds of bodies leaned forward with the shared hunger of people who came to witness proof that effort matters. While I sat there in my front row seat feeling the odd combination of invisibility and spotlight that comes when the camera lens floats over your head in a live stream, and yet the two people you once tried to impress with refrigerator report cards have elected to keep cucumbers on their eyelids rather than their eyes on you. Names began to flow, each syllable a small victory for someone who had dragged themselves through deadlines and cafeteria politics, and as I watched classmates accept diplomas and flash quick smiles toward clumps of cheering relatives, I felt that familiar pinch under my ribs, not jealousy exactly, more like the pressure you feel when you realize that a thing you have been told is complicated is actually very simple. Some people show up and some people do not. And the math of that equation has been quietly balancing itself against your self-worth for years. My English teacher, Mr. Kerr, spotted me during a lull and leaned down to whisper that he had never doubted I would be the one to close the ceremony, that my parents must be bursting with pride, and I said thank you in a voice that did not crack. And I watched his eyes flick, just for a second, to the two seats with borrowed grandparents in them, and I saw his confusion fold itself into understanding in the practiced way of adults who know better than to ask a student why the world is unfair out loud. I took out my program and a pen, because if I let my hands sit still the little tremor that rides in on adrenaline would announce itself, and I began to mark through the opening paragraph I had written with all the diplomatic warmth of an ambassador, replacing the gentle gratitude with something that still sounded polished, but carried a different temperature, a cooler, iron core that would let me thank those who genuinely lifted us and nod, without naming, toward the vacuum where effort should have been, and while I adjusted clauses and moved a sentence about late-night study sessions to a later beat, I realized that I was not changing my message so much as stripping it of the sugar that had never been required except to make other people comfortable. The air conditioning clicked louder against the heat of the packed house, tassels tickled cheeks, programs fluttered like cautious birds, and somewhere behind me a toddler let out a squeal that made a row of grandparents beam. I glanced at the large screen above the stage where the school's live stream showed a wide shot of the audience, and I thought about the relatives scattered across the country who were watching their kids and grandkids with a pride that had nothing performative about it, which reminded me that being seen did not always require physical proximity, and on a thread pulled taut between impulse and intention I opened my phone, found the family group chat, and pasted the link to the live stream with a line that read, "If you're between treatments, you can still watch," after which I muted the thread before their replies could roll across my focus like pebbles dropped in a clear pool. Perhaps that was petty. Perhaps it was the emotional equivalent of flicking a light on in a room where someone hoped to tiptoe in the dark, but it settled me in a way I cannot fully justify and yet do not regret, because it forced a choice they would not be able to prettify later. Either they would tune in and witness the moment they refused to attend, or they would scroll past their own daughter to safeguard the mood of a spa day, and either outcome clarified things. Mia squeezed my hand from the neighboring chair, a quick, firm press that said she had seen the movement and approved, and then the superintendent took the microphone to deliver remarks about resilience and community. Words that were both true and a little too broad for the private weather systems clouding many of our rows. As the last cluster of names went by and the clapping swelled and fell in waves, my phone, still muted, lit with the feral persistence of people who dislike being cornered. A stream of previews, my aunt's, watching, my father's, let's discuss after, my mother's. Please do not embarrass us, and Lily's, you're being dramatic, that I did not open, because the point of a boundary is not the argument you can have about it, but the quiet act of holding it. The principal glanced toward me with that subtle nod that says the baton is about to change hands, and in the pressurized seconds before my name would be called, I slid the program into my folder, let my shoulders find a posture my grandmother would have praised, and gave myself one last directive that felt like armor: be precise, be calm, be undeniable. Then the principal said my name with crisp care. The audience began to applaud. The lights seemed to hitch brighter as the camera found my face, and somewhere under the applause and the band and the breath moving in my own chest, I felt the clean click of a decision I could no longer reverse, because my feet were already rising, my palms were already drying themselves against the gown, and the walk to the microphone stretched ahead like a narrow bridge over water that looked deceptively still. I reached the podium with the careful steps of someone who has counted every crack in the path already, placed my folder on the acrylic surface that always looks strangely like a dessert display case, and let the applause taper into that delicate hush that feels, for a fragile beat, like the world is actually listening. Then I took a breath that was not the deep cleansing kind they recommend in yoga videos, but the smaller, more practical inhale you take before lifting a heavy box, and I looked out at the wave of faces arranged in rows, a living graph of who shows up when it matters and who does not. And I began not with the line I had polished last week, but with a simple acknowledgement that our class had been built in kitchens and carpools and after-school parking lots, in tutoring sessions held at dining tables and in pep talks delivered across grocery aisles. Because the scaffolding for these diplomas was never just homework and caffeine, but the stubborn love of people who chose to be present even when nobody was filming. I thanked the teachers the way I had planned, specifically and with examples, because gratitude is not diminished by conflict, and I called out Mr. Kerr for pretending pop quizzes were character development, which made him laugh and blush. And I thanked the cafeteria staff for keeping us fed on days when our brains felt like old phones stuck at 10%, and that won me an honest cheer from the back. Then I pivoted, not sharply, but with the slow turn of a ship that knows exactly where it wants to dock, and I said that today's ceremony was for the students who kept showing up to themselves even when the audience was inconsistent, that some of us had learned to clap for our own progress in empty living rooms, and that the sound of that lonely clapping had taught us a resilience no textbook could cover, which made the front rows lean in because truth, when delivered without apology, has its own gravity. I told a story about studying at the kitchen counter while a sibling loudly decided on nail colors, a detail innocuous enough to be universal and pointed enough to draw its own map, and I added, with a smile that did not advertise hostility yet carried a warning label, that support looks like more than a text with heart emojis or a promise to make it up later. That support looks like parking the car and finding a seat and cheering until your throat is sore. And the audience murmured the way audiences do when they recognize themselves in a mirror they did not expect to be handed, while the screen above the stage caught my face in the same flat light that had once made me look small and suddenly made me look steadier than I felt. Then I said the line I had not rehearsed, but had been composing in the silent workshop of my chest since the moment I saw that spa photo, and I said it as if I were setting down a glass object that could break if slammed yet would cut if ignored. This one is for everyone who could not be bothered to show up, and I let the sentence hang like a wind chime in a still room, delicate and unmistakable, and though I did not name anyone, the message had an address, and the mail was delivered, because a collective intake of breath rolled through the floorboards and a hush more profound than politeness settled into the aisles, the kind of silence that registers as impact rather than absence. I did not linger there, because revenge that gapes at itself curdles, so I moved forward into the part where I talked about what we had learned from being underestimated, that when applause is rationed you learn to manufacture your own courage in bulk, and that some of us will carry that skill into boardrooms and break rooms and late-night hospital lobbies, and we will not need anyone to validate our entry because we have already walked toward goals with no parade in sight. And while I stitched those thoughts to the next paragraph, I saw movement at the back where the doors opened to the lobby, a cluster forming around the screens that displayed the live stream, phones lifted like guided moths, and against that glow a posture I knew by instinct. Lily's tilt of the chin, a familiar silhouette in a robe the color of smug calm, and for a brief second the absurdity nearly made me laugh, because even now she had found the light. I closed the speech by naming the classmates whose parents were juggling double shifts and those whose grandparents had stepped in with quiet heroism, by inviting everyone who had ever filled a lunch account or driven a carpool to stand so we could thank them with real noise, and the room rose like bread in a warm oven, generous and full, and when the clapping ebbed I returned to the single necessary point, that we are not the sum of who attends our milestones, we are the sum of who we decide to be when no one is watching. Then I said thank you and stepped back, and the applause that followed felt like a weather change I had organized with a barometer and stubbornness rather than a storm I stumbled into. As I left the podium, the principal reached for a handshake and whispered that my words were brave in that careful tone adults use when something makes them simultaneously proud and a little uneasy. And I nodded because I knew I had walked the edge without slipping into a rant. Then my phone, still muted, trembled again inside my gown, and while I moved down the steps the screen flashed an unread preview from Lily that said, "Come outside now," which, all things considered, felt like a summons rather than an invitation, and I followed the aisle toward the exit, heart beating with the measured confidence of someone who has one last card to play and suspects it will land exactly where it must. The moment I stepped outside, the humid air clung to my gown and the crowd noises fractured into fragments of laughter, car horns, and the shuffle of shoes across pavement. But all of that blurred as soon as I caught sight of Lily leaning against the brick wall of the auditorium, her phone clutched like a weapon she did not quite know how to use, mascara streaking in dark rivers down her cheeks, and the glossy robe she had worn to the spa now looking like the costume of a child caught sneaking on stage during a performance. She did not start with words of apology or even anger. She simply hissed my name with the kind of sharpness she usually reserved for when she thought someone else had stolen her moment, and she demanded to know why I would humiliate them. Why I could not have just let it slide one more time. Why I felt the need to weaponize a podium. I let her words tumble over me like hailstones that sting but do not pierce, because I had already rehearsed this confrontation in my mind the night before, when the glow of her spa post had seared itself into my retinas. I told her that the humiliation was not manufactured by me but by the emptiness of those seats, that the microphone had simply amplified what had already been screaming in silence for years, and I reminded her of birthdays derailed, competitions ignored, dinners cut short, all sacrificed to the altar of her moods and comforts. For the first time, I watched her blink not with defiance, but with recognition, as though some part of her had known all along that the scale had been tilted and had simply hoped I would never drag it into balance. Behind her, through the wide glass doors of the auditorium, I saw parents still hugging their kids and taking photos, the kind of moments my own parents had decided to outsource to champagne flutes and cucumber slices. And I felt something tighten and then release inside my chest. My phone buzzed again with messages I still refused to read, but I could imagine their tone, my mother begging me to undo what had already burned itself into the gossip chain. My father clumsily attempting to rationalize exhaustion as if self-care could be equated with desertion. And when Lily muttered that I had gone too far, that people were staring at her as if she were the villain of some melodrama. I told her calmly that for once she was experiencing a fraction of what it felt like to stand in the shadows while the applause went elsewhere. Mia appeared then, carrying 2 bottles of water, and she slipped one into my hand without asking if I needed it, because she knew, in the way that real friends always know, that the shaking in my fingers had nothing to do with dehydration. She glanced at Lily, at the ruined makeup and the tight fists, and then looked back at me with a small nod that said everything without words. You did what you had to do, and you do not need to apologize for it. The relief of that solidarity cut through the static in my head, and for a fleeting second I almost laughed, because I realized that in every way that mattered, I had already built a better family than the one I had been born into. 2 hours later, the campus was nearly empty, stray programs fluttering across the parking lot like lost birds, and I sat on the curb, still in my gown, staring at the sky that had started to tint with the colors of evening. Lily had stormed off after our argument, her shoulders rigid and her voice cracking with fury as she barked into her phone, likely to my mother, and I imagined the frantic conversations happening in living rooms and on speakerphones. Relatives dissecting the moment I had claimed the stage and turned a celebration into an indictment. The image of their faces, caught off guard by consequences they had always assumed they were immune to, brought a sharp kind of satisfaction that was not sweet but steady, like finally setting a bone that had healed crooked. When I finally peeled off the cap and gown and folded them into the back seat of Mia's car, I felt lighter, not because the weight of years of favoritism had vanished, but because I had stopped pretending it did not exist. I thought about the way the room had fallen into that stunned silence after my unscripted line, about the way heads had turned and whispers had spread, and I knew that those words would linger long after the chairs were stacked and the banners taken down. Perhaps my parents would craft a story to defend themselves, perhaps Lily would post some performative caption about resilience, but the truth was already out there, carved into the ceremony itself, and it could not be clawed back. That night, alone in my room with the gown draped over my chair, I finally opened the family chat. The messages were a wall of accusations, pleas, half-hearted explanations, and silence from people who had always been loud when it came to Lily but muted when it came to me. I did not reply. Instead, I turned off my phone and faced the mirror. The girl staring back at me was not softer or sweeter or more forgiving than she had been that morning, but she was sharper, clearer, a person who had stopped waiting for roses from people who would rather spend their money on spa treatments. I do not know what the next holiday will look like, whether we will sit at the same table in brittle silence or whether I will be conspicuously absent in a way that gnaws at them the way their absence gnawed at me. What I do know is that I have finally stopped carrying the burden of pretending their choices did not wound me, and I have stopped cushioning the truth with apologies they never earned. And as I lay down to sleep, I understood that the applause of strangers, the nods of teachers, the squeeze of Mia's grandmother's hand, and the sight of my sister in tears outside the auditorium were not revenge in the cinematic sense. But they were enough to remind me that I did not need their presence to prove I was worth celebrating.